let's get started making an airplane block. So we are going to start with the section of the block that is going to make the nose cone and the wing. This is the airplane that's going straight up and down. And again, notice that each part of the block is numbered. So we've got part B1, B2, B3, and B4. And again, we want to always start with the one that's numbered number 1. And that's the piece where we folded the extra 1/4 inch line for our seam allowance, because our goal is to take our fabric and have it cover that entire section so that we've got fabric going into our seam allowance all the way around. If you turn this over, we're going to position our fabric on the back. You're going to be able to more easily see that section. So we've got our seam allowances folded here, and we want our fabric to cover that. We're going to start by putting a little bit of glue from a washable school glue stick right in the center of that section. That's going to help hold our fabric in place. And then we're going to position our fabric piece on there so that it extends into each of those sections of seam allowance. And it's cut at a rectangle, but the first thing we're going to do is trim that so that it matches our piece so that we can get everything lined up. And you can see I've got it going all the way around. You can actually see through the paper that it's easily going to cover all of our seam allowances. So let's start by trimming this to get our seam allowance on each side. So we're going to go to our cutting board, and we're going to fold our paper right along this stitching line. And the reason we're folding along this stitching line is that we're going to use our add a 1/4 ruler to add a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So again, you're going to see on the back of this add a 1/4 ruler, there's a little lip here, and we're just going to take that lip and butt it right up next to that folded paper. That's going to give us a really accurate 1/4 inch seam, and it's not going to move on us. You can see it just stops right when it hits that folded paper. So we'll take our rotary cutter and we'll trim that piece away. And then we'll trim the other side of the block right along. Now we want to make sure that we're folding on our stitching line, not our seam allowance line, or we're going to have too much fabric in there. So fold on the stitching line, put your add a 1/4 ruler, butt it up against that, and then cut that away. And then you're ready to add your next piece of fabric. We'll go back to our sewing machine, which is B2, and that's going to make the sky that's on the side. Now you're going to notice that I've cut a fairly large rectangle here, bigger than we need for that piece, but it's going to enable us to line this up and know that we've got plenty to cover. So again, we're going to position our fabric on the back, and my trick on this is that I line this up, I fold it as if I was stitching it, and then I make sure that it's covering that whole piece around. We're going to trim all this excess away. It's a little bit wasteful, I guess, on fabric, but the time saving that we get and the accuracy that we get is definitely worth a little bit of fabric. So I've positioned that piece in place. I'm just going to use my fingers to hold that so it doesn't shift. If you want, you could stick some pins in here, but personally I find it easy enough just to hold this, flip it over, and then I'm ready to stitch. Now, when we stitch this, there's a couple things to keep in mind. First of all, it's best if you have a little bit larger needle than normal. A size 100 needle is great. This is actually a size 90, and I like using that too, but a 90 or 100 is going to be good. And we want to make our stitch length a little bit lower than normal. So we're going to go all the way down to a 1.5 stitch length. The reason we want a bigger needle and a smaller stitch length is that every stitch is going to perforate that paper, which is going to make it really easy to cut away, or tear away, not cut, but tear away. We're also going to want to make sure that we're stitching all the way out beyond our 1/4 inch seam allowance. So you can kind of see that line that I've folded. I'm going to make sure that I stitch a little bit beyond that, and I just kind of have to eyeball that because I want to stitch straight on this seam line. I'm going to make sure my needle down is engaged in case I have to stop and reposition, and then I'm just going to stitch this stitching line. And we're stitching right along the line, so we're going to have really accurate results. and I go all the way out to the edge. Snippers and snip that thread, and we've got our first piece in place. Now what we need to do is press this, and we can use our iron with our ironing mat, or we can use our little pressing tool on our ByAnnie's pressing stiletto and pressing tool, and we're just going to use that to press that seam really nicely in place. Then we're ready to add our other sky piece. Let's come back to our machine, get our other piece, and again we're going to line it up. I don't need much sticking out up here. Turn that around where it's a little bit straighter on this side. I want more down here because this piece I know is going to cover up there. So I'll just double check it again, making sure it covers it all. That looks good. Bring this back around, hold those pieces in place, flip it over, and I'm ready to stitch that in place. And again, I'm going to add my seam allowance, so I'm going to start all the way out here off the paper, stitch right along my stitching line. Good 1/4 inch beyond, and then trim that away. All right. Now we need to trim this piece so that we can add our wings. So that's pressed, and we're ready to trim this to put the wing on. So what we're going to have to do here is tear this away a little bit from the paper so that we get to our stitching line, and we can fold on that. Tear this away a little bit to get to our stitching line, and then fold it right along that folded stitching line. And then again, we're going to use our add a 1/4 ruler to trim this away. And I'm not going to worry about the outside edges until I've got the whole section done. So right now we're just going to trim the piece for adding the wing. All right, so now we're ready to add our wings. So we'll open our pattern up, we'll get our wing piece, and we'll align it right on here. And we want to make sure that it extends on each side. I actually cut this out so that my yellow line was right in the center. I'm just going to eyeball that and scoot that over a little bit so it's right where I want it. I'll position these pieces in place, hold it all together, flip it, and then I'm ready to sew. Again, I'll start all the way off the paper and stitch a 1/4, or stitch my seam allowance, and then right on my stitching line all the way across. Our section is almost ready to go. This is a pretty large seam, so I'm actually going to press this with an iron. So we'll just move our little ironing mat in here. Use our little travel iron. A travel iron and a small ironing mat are perfect for this. Sometimes I set up a little TV tray right next to where I'm working. Otherwise, it's a great way to get a few steps in and some activity, because you can get up and walk to your ironing board across the room after each step, and you'll get lots of exercise. But we're going to press that really nicely all the way across, and then we're going to trim this section, and it's going to be ready to add to our block. So now, to trim this, we're going to want to get a rotary cutting ruler, not our add a 1/4 ruler. And we're going to position it with our 1/4 inch line right on top of that outside stitching line. So we've got that aligned all the way across. I need to get this out of the way so I can work here. trim all 4 sides. Again, we're lining our ruler up so that the 1/4 inch line is right on that stitching line. We're not really paying a lot of attention to the line that's already printed. We'd rather line it up with the stitching line. And our section is complete. So, let me show you what each section will look at. So we've just completed this section, a second one, so we've got our second block going. This is section D for the block, which makes our propeller. Then we have our nose cone and our wings. Then we have our fuselage. And lastly, we have our tail. Once we've got all 4 of those sections done, then we'll sew these sections together. So let me show you how that works. I'm going to leave my paper on here for this. And I'm going to line this one up. I want to make sure that my paper and fabric are all even. I'm going to put a little wonder clip on here. And this piece over again, I want to make sure my fabric's right even with my paper. Another wonder clip. Wonder clips are so much easier than trying to put pins through this. Line this up across here. And then it's just a simple matter of sewing across this seam, right on this stitching line. And if we've done our work correctly, that should line up exactly on the other side. So let's go back and sew that. That section, if you turn it over, our line goes right along our previous line there, and then we can press this open, we can join the next 2 pieces, and we'll have our entire block done. Now I leave the paper in this until my whole block is completed, and actually until all the blocks are completed for my quilt, and then I tear the paper out and assemble my quilt with the plain blocks in. When you get ready to tear this out, it's easiest if you go right along here. We'll tear this center section out. So you might want to pull it away a little bit where it's in the seam allowances, but then because we've done all that perforation with our smaller stitch length and our larger needle, it's really a simple matter of pulling this away. And there you have it, a beautiful paper-pieced airplane block, and you're well on your way to making a fun quilt.